Today, we're taking a deep dive into the chilling history of the plague, a disease that was so notorious it haunted entire civilizations like a shadow that they couldn't escape. At various moments, it crept through cities and villages and leaving devastation in its wake. And if you were to look it up in an encyclopedia or scroll through Wikipedia, you'll find the plague described as an infectious disease caused by a cunning bacterium called Yersinia pestis. But it's so much more than that. It's a bacterial force that has shaped history and altered the course of humanity. Let's pause for a moment to reflect on something important, especially in light of the times we're living in. Even if you're not a science enthusiast by now, many of us come to understand that bacteria and viruses are two very different beasts. Now, I have to offer a quick apology to any medical experts or epidemiologists in the room. And I know this might be a bit of an oversimplification, but here what has picked up so far along the way. Viruses are notoriously tricky to deal with. We often find ourselves struggling to effectively treat viral infections. On the flip side, when it comes to bacterial infections, we've got a powerful weapon, that is antibiotics. These medications are our frontline defense and specifically designed to combat bacteria, not viruses. And while they revolutionized modern medicine, the distinction between these two types of pathogens is key to understanding how we fight them. Of course, there is a growing debate around antibiotic resistance that states that bacteria are evolving, becoming more resilient, and making it harder for antibiotics to do their job as effectively as they once did. But since the 1940s, antibiotics have been our powerful allies in the fight against bacterial diseases. Thanks to these advancements, we made significant progress in treating infections like the plague. Yet, despite these strides, viral illnesses continue to present a formidable challenge, reminding us that our battle against disease is far from over. It might sound paradoxical, but would actually be better equipped to handle a plague epidemic today than the one that we battled for a few years at this part. The plague is primarily transmitted through animals, especially rodents, with fleas acting as the key carriers of the bacteria. In the past, rats were everywhere, infesting old buildings, bustling urban centers, and even rural homes. Their presence, coupled with the lack of modern sanitation, made outbreaks nearly inevitable. While we've learned how to control these conditions, we still face a different kind of challenge today, one that doesn't play by the same rules. In the past, rats, along with other wild rodents like squirrels in the plains of America, were the primary carriers of the plague. The disease, especially its notorious in its bubonic form, that spreads through fleas that feed on these infected animals. Once the fleas have bitten an infected rat, they transfer the bacteria to humans with their next bite, settling a stage for devastating outbreaks. The cycle of transmission was a major factor in the widespread impact of the plague throughout history. So here's a quick overview. The plague typically presents in two main forms, with bubonic plague being the most common and notorious. This form is marked by swollen lymph nodes known as buboes, which usually appear in the armpits and groin. The swollen nodes were alarming to people in the past, but they actually indicate that the body's immune system is actively fighting the infection, even if the symptoms look frightening. The bubonic plague becomes truly deadly when it progresses to septicemia. At this stage, the bacteria enters the bloodstream, resulting in a serious condition where abnormal blood clots form. This can cause black spots, bruising, and even necrosis in the extremities, hence the ominous name of Black Death. There is an even more severe form of plague called pneumonic plague. Unlike the bubonic plague, pneumonic plague spreads through the air via droplets, similar to how COVID-19 is transmitted, which is why we used to wear masks up to that extent. Now, whether they would work or not, that debate has been settled. This form has an even higher fatality rate than the bubonic plague, making it particularly a formidable threat. While the plague is undeniably terrifying, depictions in film and documentaries often exaggerates the horror. Think of blood eruptions and dramatic extremes. In reality, aside from the notorious buboes, the plague often presents more like severe pneumonia. Symptoms include high fever, headaches, joint pain, and nausea. As it progresses, it can lead to drowsiness, lethargy, delirium, and even suffocation. In many languages, including various European ones, the term plague was fairly understood and it was common. In ancient Greece, the common term was the word loimos. When the plague struck Athens during the Peloponnesian War, which began in 431 BC, it reached a devastating outbreak in 430 BC. So people recalled an old oracle who had predicted that a plague would be linked to the conflict with Sparta, drawing a direct connection between the war and the outbreak of the disease. In our languages, the term plague once was used broadly to describe a high fatal and contagious epidemic. Today, we don't rely on oracles, but scientists, and we examine past epidemics that were historically labeled as plagues. For example, the so-called plague of Athens, which claimed the life of Pericles, who was a prominent and influential statesman, orator, and general during Athens' golden age. That was likely not the plague, but rather typhus. Another notorious epidemic known as the Antonine Plague or the Plague of the Antonines ravaged the Roman Empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius and the Antonine dynasty. Although historical texts label it as plague, it remains uncertain whether it was actually smallpox or measles. Today, measles may seem like a minor childhood illness, but when it strikes a population that has never encountered it before, it can be catastrophic. So historically, this phenomenon contributed to a significant depopulation of the Americas following European colonization. The Antonine Plague had profound historical effects, and the Roman Empire faced severe manpower shortages due to the epidemic. The shortage was not uniform across the empire, but had a significant impact over generations, and areas with dwindling population face issues like insufficient agricultural labor, leading to complaints from landowners about their inability to farm their lands effectively. These grievances were directed towards the tax office, which in turn led to demands for reduced tax payments. The military also faced shortages of recruits, which strained the empire's defenses. In response to these challenges, the Roman government made a crucial decision to allow immigration. It looks like something is repeating so far. This policy, implemented by the ruling class of the time, was pivotal for the empire's survival over the centuries. It was a pragmatic solution to the demographic and economic pressures caused by the epidemics in that case, highlighting how historical events shaped policies and adaptations that would affect the empire for generations. Now, it's a historical fact that the Roman Empire, over generations, faced and managed labor shortages and demographic voids by integrating new populations. Of course, this shift in policy and ideology involved not only absorbing immigrants, but also employing them in various roles, including in the military. For centuries, the Roman Empire adapted to plagues and other challenges with these countermeasures. Now, turning to the plague as we know it today, the one caused by Yersinia pestis, it appeared in our world toward the end of the barbarian invasions around the 6th century. It struck Constantinople, and the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, during the reign of Emperor Justinian, who is also known for compiling the Corpus Juris Civilis, the codification of Roman law. This outbreak, which devastated Constantinople, became historically known as the Plague of Justinian. However, the plague didn't just make a single appearance. It emerged with a significant epidemic and then recurred periodically over the following years, sometimes in different regions, but always making a return. For centuries, the plague was a persistent threat, continually reducing the population and hindering its growth. It acted like a dark cloud over humanity's progress, constantly checking our ability to grow and prosper. In the aftermath of the Justinian plague, Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Arab world experienced periods of stagnation. For a couple of centuries, these areas saw no demographic or economic growth, unlike the biblical ideal where populations grow and flourish when left undisturbed. These regions were marked by a steady, if not worsening, decline due to the relentless presence of the plague. Around 750 AD, something pivotal happened. A young boy of just about 8 years old at the time, named Charles, would later become known as Charlemagne. His rise marked the beginning of a new era in Europe, the one that saw the decline of the plague's devastating grip. Charlemagne's empire wasn't just a powerful ruler with grand ambition, military conquest, and sweeping reforms. It was also about a population that no longer was ravaged by plague, that could finally start to grow and thrive. For centuries before this turning point, the European Middle Ages were characterized by stagnation, decline, and depopulation. These centuries fit the classic, somewhat grim image of the Dark Ages that many people hold. But with Charlemagne's era, things began to change dramatically. Following his reign, Europe experienced an uninterrupted period of growth. This wasn't just about an increase in population, it was a flourishing culture with economy and technology, and Europe began to build the ships and navigational tools that would eventually carry explorers like Columbus to the New World. It was a time when the compass and advanced navigation systems opened up to new trade routes to Asia, with figures like Marco Polo leading the way. The Crusades, despite the varying opinions of their motives and impacts, were part of this expansionist spirit as Europe ventured beyond its borders, shaping its destiny. Medieval Europe, after overcoming its earlier hardships, became a place of remarkable development and optimism, laying the foundation for its rich legacy of towers, castles, churches, and art that continue to capture our imagination today. The second wave of the plague, the true plague caused by Yersinia pestis, hit Europe in the years 1347 and 1348. This outbreak, vividly described by Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron, as we already mentioned in a previous episode, struck medieval Europe with an unexpected, devastating blow. It is estimated that it might have killed 30 to 60% of the population, resulting in one of the largest demographic collapses in European history. The world at that time, while facing some challenges due to overpopulation and struggling to feed everyone, was still largely on the upswing, though they were far fewer in numbers compared to us and lacked our technological and medical advancements, and the medieval people were experiencing a long period of growth and prosperity. Before the plague arrived, Europe was already suffering from frequent famines and poorer diets among the lower classes. The peasants were suffering. Yet there remained a sense of progress with population growth and expanding trade. The arrival of the plague, however, brought this growth to a sudden and devastating halt. Take the city of Siena, for example. It's a historic city in Italy, in Tuscany, known for its medieval architecture and vibrant culture. In the 1300s, this wealthy and thriving city poured its resources into building an enormous cathedral, so grand it dwarfs modern Siena, the modern city. The structure was designed to hold the entire population, a testament to the city's ambition and optimism. At the height of their prosperity, the Sienese even planned to expand the cathedral further, envisioning a future where Siena would continue to grow and perhaps even become the center of the world. But the arrival of the plague changed everything. It decimated Siena's population and brought the city's grand ambitions to a standstill, halting their plans for the cathedral's expansion, leaving behind a sobering reminder of how quickly prosperity can turn into a crisis. The people of Siena had grand ambitions for their cathedral, planning to build a massive new dome that would dwarf the existing structure, leaving it as just the transept, that is the short arm of the cross-shaped layout. Today, when you visit Siena, you should visit Siena, you can still see traces of this dream. Look at the side of the cathedral and you will find a towering unfinished wall with two completed floors and some marble cladding that are abruptly cut off. That's all that remains of their once audacious vision. The plague has a unique pattern. It strikes with a devastating first wave, but it doesn't disappear. After its initial impact, the plague would return intermittently. In the latter half of the 1300s, it stuck every 10 to 15 years. Not with the same ferocity as the first time, but still causing significant death tolls. It wouldn't sweep across all Europe as before. Instead, it would affect different regions at different times, but it always claimed lives. This relentless cycle of plague outbreaks prevented Europe from fully recovering. Unlike other disasters where populations rebound, the plague stifled any such recovery. By the time of the Renaissance, Europe's population was still about half of what it had been in the Middle Ages. The continent had literally emptied out, and thus the population persisted for a long time, slowing Europe's recovery and reshaping its future. Despite various measures taken to curb the plague's impact, the disease's virulence never fully disappeared, and it continued to re-emerge right up to the 1600s and even into the early 1700s. For over 3 centuries, 15 generations of Europeans lived under the constant ominous threat of an unseen enemy, always ready to strike again at any moment. However, humanity showcased an impressive ability to contain the plague, limiting its spread and reducing its contagion. By the second half of the 1600s and into the early 1700s, major outbreaks were better managed. For instance, the Great Plague of London in 1665 and the 1711 epidemic in Copenhagen, tragically claiming a third of the city's population, were contained within the respective cities. The final significant outbreak in Europe, the Plague of Marseille in 1720, affected Marseille and parts of Provence, we're speaking about France, but was ultimately brought under control. After that, the plague vanished from Europe entirely. However, it didn't disappear elsewhere. In the late 19th century, as doctors began studying the disease and identified the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the plague had already made a significant comeback in India and China, though Europe remained largely free of it. In India, the plague ravaged the country until World War I, while it persisted in China well into the 1920s. Notably, the plague was still present in Manchuria during the early 1920s, where modern scientific studies were conducted. Now, the name Yersinia pestis honors Alexander Yersin, a bacteriologist who isolated the plague bacillus in 1894 during an outbreak in Hong Kong. He was a Franco-Swiss scientist of Russian descent, and Yersin played a pivotal role in identifying the pathogen behind the plague. His work marked a significant turning point in our understanding of this devastating disease, bridging the end of the 19th century and the dawn of the 20th century. So you should know that the bubonic plague has not disappeared. It still exists in the world today. Each year, around 600 reported cases of plague are documented, and thanks to modern treatment, most people recover. While there are about 100 deaths annually, this is a small fraction compared to the past. Good news is that these cases occur in all continents except Europe and Oceania. but in other continents the plague remains endemic. The plague is also present in the United States, where the last significant epidemic occurred in Los Angeles in 1924, resulting in 30 deaths. While this figure pales in comparison to historical outbreaks, it still carries a notable emotional weight. So similarly, the cholera outbreak in Naples in the 1970s, in Naples in Italy, which also claimed 20 to 30 lives, left a significant impact. Since then, plague has not entirely disappeared from the US. On average, there are about 7 cases each year, very few fatalities, though there were 4 deaths in 2015. In the US, the plague remains endemic among prairie rodents in the southwestern states, including Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Southern California. Each year, there is a risk for farmers of being bitten by fleas that have just fed on infected squirrels or rats. This serves as a reminder that the symptoms of the plague are not always very recognizable. While the mortality rate is frightening, the symptoms can resemble those of many other severe diseases, making them difficult to identify. In the US, misdiagnosis has occurred even during the 1924 Los Angeles epidemic, where initial assessments included pneumonia or venereal disease due to the presence of buboes in the groin. More recently, cases have been misdiagnosed as acute appendicitis or meningitis. Identifying the plague is not simple, so vigilance is important. As I mentioned, the plague is a significant part of our history and culture. The Great Plague of, at least from the European standpoint, from my side at least, the Great Plague of 1348 was a shocking event that profoundly impacted everyone at the time. Although people began to rebuild and recover once it ended, the experience left a lasting impression. Many chroniclers documented it, particularly the writers of the era. In Italy, one of the most notable accounts comes from Boccaccio, who captured the impact of the plague better than anyone else. Boccaccio's opera of the Decameron was, in fact, staged during the plague, because you had 7 women and 3 men who went in the countryside to live together for 10 days in order to isolate themselves and wait for the plague to go by. So Boccaccio wrote the opera with the plague in mind because he experienced that firsthand as well. Boccaccio notes that doctors each offered their opinions, but he concluded it was of no use. He also mentions other futile measures, such as humble supplications and various processions directed to God, all made by the people in hopes of relief. This action aligns with our stereotypes about people in the Middle Ages. Instead of establishing a health office, we might expect them to engage in processions and religious fervor, seeking divine interventions rather than practical solutions. Boccaccio doesn't say, and we all began to pray. Rather, it was the devout who did so. It was a deeply religious world after all, but there was a clear distinction between those who turned to prayer and those who sought medical advice. Ultimately, it made no difference. The plague arrived in the spring of the predicted year and began to reveal its horrific effects. Unlike in the East, where reports indicated that anyone who bled from the nose faced inevitable death, Boccaccio provides a different account. He notes that there were no signs of nosebleeds or blood vomiting. Instead, the plague manifested through swellings of the groin or under the armpits. Some swellings resembled a common apple, while others looked like eggs, which the common people referred to as gavazzoli. This suggests that while Asia may have experienced pneumonic plague, the version that arrived in Europe was the bubonic plague. The common people who spoke Italian didn't have a term for the plague, so they had to invent one. Having never encountered this disease before, the Florentines initially referred to as the cabbage, the garozzo, or the death bringer. After the buboes appeared, black or livid spots would emerge on the arms, thighs, and other parts of the body, certain signs of impending death. Boccaccio observes that as the plague spread, everyone began to seek ways to cure the disease. It was a time crowded with self appointed medical experts. Remember something? Despite his awareness of the futility of their efforts, Boccaccio remarks that it was all in vain. Everyone was largely ignorant. Among doctors, there were not just scholars, but also others who claimed to know how to treat the illness. And this indicates that in that world, doctors existed, yes, who had studied for years at universities that were well respected and well paid. They had some proficiency in surgery and understood certain medical concepts. However, their training was rooted in ancient doctrines about the human body inherited from Greek and Roman thought, while this understanding focus on balancing humors like blood, bile, heat, and cold was intriguing. It proved fundamentally ineffective to treat actual diseases. This wasn't merely medieval ignorance, it was a legacy that limited their ability to confront the plague effectively because they experienced that for the first time after all. And so the scientists were highly respected and well paid, but they couldn't cure the plague, but neither could anyone else. Boccaccio says there was a vast number of both women and men with no medical training who presented themselves as healers, convinced they had the cure. He mentions both women and men, placing women first, highlighting how common it was for women to seek to help and care for the sick. This isn't by chance. While the esteemed doctor from the university was typically a man, the act of caring for the ill was seen as a role that women naturally fulfilled. This was clearly a patriarchal and male-dominated society, after all, with distinctly separate roles. Men occupied all public positions, work, politics, and warfare, while women were primarily associated with private spaces like the home and child rearing. However, women held significant responsibility for two crucial moments in life: birth and death. Birth is pretty straightforward, as is the woman who carries the baby and delivers it. However, what's less obvious is that during labor, it was always other women, sisters, friends, and neighbors who gathered to comfort and assist the mother, especially those who had experience with childbirth. So men typically stayed away. And the same applied to illness and death. Women surrounded the sick, and when someone died, it was the woman who mourned and prepared the body for burial. This dynamic was well established. If a man tried to intervene, the women would firmly tell him, "Get out of the way. This is something that we do." At this point, we grasp the profound impact of the epidemic on established customs. When Boccaccio notes that the sick were left alone to die, it's significant that not only were many women absent, but countless individuals passed away without witnesses. For a man of that era, this was inconceivable. Death was always accompanied by others, especially women who provided comfort at the end. Boccaccio provides further reflections on the disease beyond its symptoms. He emphasizes the epidemic's undeniable characteristics, which align with accounts from other chroniclers across Europe. First and foremost is the extremely high mortality rate. Few of those who fell ill managed to recover. Most died within 3 days of symptoms onset, some even sooner. And many passed away without experiencing fever or other notable symptoms. Other secondary sources who documented the Black Death, they were not really secondary, but contemporaneously with Boccaccio, include Giovanni Villani, an Italian chronicler from Florence, who wrote extensively about the plague in his work Nuova Cronica. He detailed the rapid spread of the plague in Florence, describing the high mortality rate and the social chaos that ensued, including abandonment and fear among the population. Jean Faussat, a French historian whose writings included accounts of the social and economic impact of the plague in France and England, highlighting the disruption of the daily life and, of course, the breakdown of social order. Then we have Richard of Bury, an English scholar and author who reflected on the plague's effects in his work Philobiblon or Philobiblion. Yes, that's the correct term. He reflected on the plague's impact on the population and the economy, lamenting the loss of life and the challenges faced by communities. And at last, we have the monk of St. Albans, an English chronicler who recorded the plague's devastation in England, and he recorded the toll of the plague that took on England, emphasizing the overwhelming number of deaths and the widespread fear it caused among the populace. This challenges the faith in how doctors described the disease. Boccaccio emphasizes its extreme contagiousness, noting that the plague struck the healthy without warning. He likens its spread to fire, consuming dry material, just as getting too close to a fire can ignite something. Being near the sick could make one ill. The fear was that even touching the clothes of anything they had come into contact with could lead to infection. This pervasive anxiety shaped how people interacted during the pandemic. Boccaccio also notes that the plague affected animals, a detail corroborated also by others. He recounts witnessing two pigs in the street that had rummaged through rags discarded from a plague victim. Shortly after, they fell dead as if poisoned. This observation highlights the pervasive nature of the disease, reinforcing the sense of danger it posed not just in humans but in all living creatures in the vicinity. In this last case, I might question Boccaccio's account, saying well, listen, you might be spinning here. You may be on a spinning tail. But this conflicts with what we know, as the plague doesn't transmit to those types of animals. However, many of the observations I've shared from Boccaccio are corroborated by other witnesses, not just in the 14th century, but throughout various plagues in Europe, right up to the outbreak of Marseille in the 1720. This is also confirmed by numerous studies. While it's challenging to gather precise data from the 14th century, later examination of plague victims have yielded valuable statistics. In a 17th century village, for instance, a parish priest diligently recorded every birth, marriage, and burial, allowing for detailed statistic analysis. Up until the early 18th century, the plague remained a highly contagious disease that devastated families. Research shows that often plague victims were the only ones in their family to die, or when one person fell ill, it frequently led to the deaths of other family members as well. The disease spreads through direct contact, highlighting both its extreme contagion and high mortality rate. Historians have noted that the accounts from doctors studying the plague in China and India at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century differ from earlier descriptions. While the presence of buboes is a commonality, the transmission of the bubonic plague in India was observed to be much slower. For instance, in 1896, the existence of railways allowed for more mobility, yet the plague did not spread rapidly from person to person as it did in the 14th century in Europe. Families often had time to isolate sick members and seek medical help, leading to a more controlled response and fewer secondary infections within households. Even more striking is the observation from the large plague epidemics of the 19th and 20th centuries in China and in India, where Western doctors and nurses, despite being in continuous contact with the sick and lacking antibiotics, rarely fell ill. This suggests that the primary vector of this transmission is the flea, which doesn't automatically mean that close contact with the sick person will result in a flea bite. This contrasts with the diseases spread through respiratory droplets, where proximity significantly increases the risk of contagion. Thus, the dynamic of transmission in these later outbreaks appear to differ from those in the earlier European epidemics. The mortality rates from the bubonic plague varied significantly between outbreaks. The plague that ravaged Europe was particularly devastating. For instance, in Copenhagen in 1711, it killed about 22,000 people out of a population of 60,000, approximately a third in just a few months. In contrast, the plague that affected India and China in 1896 and 1914 resulted in the deaths of around 12 million people, which was about 4% of the population over those 2 decades. The stark difference underscores how the earlier outbreaks could decimate local populations in a matter of months, while the later outbreaks had a slower, although still tragic, impact. Such statistics leave little room for debate regarding the ferocity of the earlier plague. Even today, the bubonic plague thrives in tropical climates because fleas struggle to survive in cold environments. As a result, regions like the southwest of the United States, Peru, and Madagascar are current reservoirs of the disease. Historically, the plague from the 14th to the 17th century was also devastating in Scandinavia. The bubonic plague is typically a summer disease, as cooler weather kills fleas and causes the plague to recede. However, the historical plague exhibited a different behavior, capable of breaking out suddenly and devastating populations even in the middle of the winter. Lastly, medieval chroniclers and writers like Boccaccio noted the deaths of dogs, cats, and pigs, which surprises modern scientists. However, they did not mention the deaths of rats, which are crucial to the cycle of bubonic plague. This absence raises questions about the understanding of disease transmission at the time and how the plague was perceived. This is something particularly striking about the plague epidemics known in modern times, as highlighted in a significant work by Albert Camus in his novel, The Plague, written in 1947. He explores the themes of human resilience, suffering, and the absurdity of life through the story of a fictional outbreak of bubonic plague. Camus uses the plague as a metaphor for existential crisis, illustrating how people react to the randomness of suffering and the inevitability of death. The characters' responses range from denial and despair to solidarity and heroism, emphasizing the importance of community and human connection in the face of crisis. Camus suggests that while life can be absurd and tragic, individuals can find meaning through their actions and relationships, even in the most challenging circumstances. Now, Camus imagines the plague breaking out in a modern city. In this case, it's the city of Oran in Algeria, a fully French city in the 1940s, bustling with French people, cars, shops, trains, newspaper, and everything. So Camus imagines the plague erupting in a contemporary city, the true plague, the bubonic plague, which kills half the population of the city. Having studied it well, he describes it with extreme clinical precision. What he illustrates is what certainly happened with the bubonic plague in India and China at the end of the 19th century, the form we know. So what happens? One day, the protagonist leaves his home, walks down the stairs and finds a dead rat on the steps. He goes to the concierge and says, "This looks a bit off." The concierge complies. The next day, he goes down the stairs and finds 2 dead rats with blood on their snouts. He tells the concierge, "Look, this is happening all over the neighborhood. The rats are found everywhere." And soon, people are saying, "God help us." A few days later, the protagonist, who is a doctor, needs to visit the concierge, who suddenly feels ill and finds him in bed with a high fever and swelling. That's how the plague breaks out. Now, no author, neither medieval nor subsequent, has ever noted that before, about the spread of the plague. Rats were dying in the streets. You might expect me to say we know exactly why these strange things are happening, but that's not the case because we do not know. The point is that today we describe the plague caused by Yersinia pestis, and we aren't entirely sure that this was indeed the cause. What swept through Europe from the Middle Ages to the modern times was likely a form of the same thing, but it has changed. And this is another thing that we've learned. The effects of the diseases in our modern world, where everything moves so fast, can change from one month to the next. In fact, it has changed. And it doesn't answer the other question one might naturally want to respond to. Why did it then disappear from Europe after the early 18th century? We attempt to provide an answer, but not with absolute certainty, but we're still investigating. The plague gradually lost its effectiveness, and this isn't a governmental ad, although human countermeasures were able to cure it. They managed to contain it and prevent its spread. Now, countermeasures were developed from the very beginning in Europe, particularly in Italy. Yes, although Boccaccio claims they were ineffective, the official responsible for removing waste realized that the plague did not come just once but returned after leaving. So they quickly implemented the full arsenal of countermeasures, the same measures they devised at the end of the Middle Ages and in the early modern period, included isolating anyone who fell ill, preventing them from going out, and isolating those who had come into contact with them. Moreover, when unusual cases arise, it's essential for doctors to be vigilant and report them to the authorities, as they could indicate the presence of the plague. Timely communication about the disease's spread is critical. A robust network of information allows for proactive measures. If there are reports of plague in a city, checkpoints can be established on roads leading to the city to prevent the spread of the infection. This coordination is vital to contain outbreaks and protect public health. So we have information, isolation, and quarantine for those arriving from potentially risky areas were all established from the end of the Middle Ages. The Italian municipalities were the very first to implement these measures, having the most advanced administrative system and culture at the time. They set up permanent health offices tasked with monitoring the situation. The rest of Europe adopted these measures somewhat later. In Scandinavia, for instance, Denmark didn't start considering quarantine and isolation until the early 16th century, primarily to safeguard the king and the court. It wasn't until the end of the 16th century that broader public health measures began to be seriously considered for the rest. Outside of Europe, the situation was even worse. In the Muslim world, in the Ottoman Empire, which governed a large part of the Muslim world bordering the Mediterranean, and was a sophisticated and cultured empire, but the Western idea of prevention did not take hold, likely due to administrative inefficiency more than fatalism. As a result, even in the 19th century, the plague was still present in the Arab and Turkish world. Even Napoleon mentions that he encountered it when he went to Egypt, when some of his soldiers became ill. Then in the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire began to modernize. Reformers advocated for public health measures similar to those in Europe, including the implementation of quarantines, which contributed to the eventual disappearance of the plague in the region. This suggests that these measures were effectively, as they helped reduce the spread of the disease and diminish its impact when applied correctly. All the major plague epidemics I mentioned earlier can generally be contained within a single city with some effort, but they all arise from negligence. Why? Well, because enforcing the measures rigidly, just like today, was bothersome back then as well. Business suffered, entrepreneurs protested, and authorities had to think twice before deciding to shut everything down. There were always those trying to circumvent the countermeasures. The plague in Marseille in 1720 broke out because a ship arriving from Syria, where the plague was present, docked at the port. Quarantine measures were in place, but the ship carried perishable goods worth a lot of money. Eventually, the authorities were persuaded to lift the quarantine. The plague then disembarked with the cargo, and even there, before declaring the plague, let's shut everything down, they hesitated due to significant economic interest. Eventually, they did act, but it was too late. The disease had already spread and devastating the city of Provence. The final point I want to discuss is how past epidemics led to dramatic transformation and offered opportunities to rethink certain economic and societal mechanisms. These crises often favored those who could adapt to and understand the new trends. Let me explain further. An epidemic of the scale of the one in 1348 devastated Italy and Europe, wiping out about a third of the population and leaving behind immense pain and suffering. The social and economic landscapes were profoundly altered as communities grappled with the loss and sought to rebuild in the aftermath. When the epidemic ends, people find themselves facing a surplus of housing, buildings, businesses, and goods. The valuables and currency remain unchanged, it's simply that there were fewer people to share them. This shift created opportunities for those who survived, leading to significant economic and social transformations. When I reopen my shop after the epidemic, my competitor is gone, allowing me to start fresh and maybe even have an edge. However, the plague returns 10 years later, making recovery difficult and inconsistent. The crucial takeaway is that the population has decreased significantly, and in this demographic shift has a lasting and structural consequence that can be ignored. Imagine the typical wool industrialist eager to restart the wool industry after the epidemic. In medieval cities, the wool industry is organized on a large scale, though it lacks machinery. Aside from some hydraulic presses powered by rivers and canals, instead of factories with concentrated workers, there are entrepreneurs who manage the process. These industrialists import wool in bulk from southern Italy, Spain, and later England, navigating the landscape transformed by the population shifts and economic opportunities created by the aftermath of the plague. Now, imagine what happens when the owner reopens and tries to contact the workers. The first person he looks for doesn't respond. He's dead. The second worker says, "I'm ready to work again, but I want 12 coins a day instead of the 10 you used to pay." The owner, frustrated, replies, "Forget it, you scoundrel, always trying to take in advantage." Moving on, he finds the next worker is also dead, and the one after that says, I've already been hired by a competitor who's paying 13 coins a day." This highlights the shifting power dynamics in the labor market post-epidemic, where surviving workers have the leverage to negotiate better wages. At this point, the typical response from the owners is not just to grumble about the crisis and demands of their workers, but to strategize. They approach local authorities and request laws to cap wages, limiting what competitors can pay. By doing so, they aim to stabilize their costs and maintain control over the labor market. If employers want to attract workers, they must comply with these new regulations, reshaping the economic landscape as competition intensifies for a diminished workforce. In the countryside, landowners are in panic mode, literally pulling their hair out, because they're facing severe shortages of labor after so many deaths. Demand for produce has dwindled and leading to fluctuations in the market. In good years, occasionally booms occur, but in bad years, grain yields drop, causing prices to skyrocket. Meanwhile, during the better years, laborers are demanding higher wages than ever before, putting even more pressure on landowners trying to run their business. This forces them to rethink their strategies in a rapidly shifting economy. Before the plague, you can find the town square filled with unemployed people looking for work for little money, much like today's immigrants in some places. But now that scene has changed. There are fewer workers, and those who are willing to work demand higher pay. While landowners are initially furious, they eventually start offering better wages. As a result, laborers in the 14th and 15th centuries, extending into the early 16th centuries, find themselves earning more than their ancestors did, marking a significant shift in the labor market. What do workers do with their newfound earnings? First and foremost, they can finally eat until full and eat well. It wasn't like that before. With their daily wages, they can afford bread and soup, ensuring everyone is satisfied. After everyone is satisfied, if the worker has a bit money left over, what does he do? If I would ask you a question, what the worker would do, a middle-aged worker would do with the leftover money, what would you answer? Invest? Well, no, he doesn't invest. He goes to the tavern. He goes to the tavern and drinks wine, and the wine trade thrives, while grain, as I mentioned, is flourishing. New taverns open, and they are always full of customers, and wine producers notice that the business is booming. The city wants wine and brings in more and more of it. When the worker returns home in the evening, his wife checks his pockets and finds some more money left. So what do? On Sundays, they indulge in meat. Sometimes even on Saturdays. This wasn't possible before. It was unthinkable. But now they can afford it. Historical tax records from an Italian city at the end of the 14th century show a surge in butcheries. In fact, there were more butcheries in places like Asti or Alessandria in the 15th century than there are today. They primarily consumed sheep, while the wealthier enjoyed beef. Still not bad at all. Meat became a staple and butchers thrived. Livestock farmers also reaped the benefits as demand for meat continued to grow in the cities. At this point, landowners in the countryside start to reassess their choices. They think, why should I keep producing grain? This isn't selling well and requires extensive labor. Instead, they convert grain fields into pastures for livestock. However, pastures need irrigation. A dry pasture isn't productive. To achieve multiple hay harvests, they need to invest in irrigation. This means enhancing existing canals, as there had already been significant efforts throughout the Middle Ages to dig irrigation channels and improve soil fertility. But starting in the 14th century, this investment in irrigation takes a leap forward. Political initiatives also play a role. Large canals are constructed under government orders, expanding the network of ditches and waterways. This leads to more pastures, marshlands, and livestock. Some begin to think, why not produce cheese? Previously, cheese was made only in the mountainous regions, in the Alps. But by the Renaissance, it starts to appear in the plains as well. In Piacenza, a delicious cheese called Piacentino emerges, which I suppose you always have tried, because let me tell you, which even the sultans buy. It gets shipped to Constantinople, and as Piacenza becomes part of Parma, the cheese changes name, and everyone starts calling it Parmigiano. It sounds familiar, but originally the name Piacentino. Thus, the Po Valley begins to thrive as a cheese-producing region. Imagine the Po Valley as this river Po goes through it, and is one of the most fertile lands in Italy, actually. Those who recognize these trends, like the growth in vineyards and wine production, begin to profit. In the evenings, after a long day in the fields, workers return from the tavern and their wives save any leftover money in a piggy bank. By year's end, they have some savings. What do? They don't invest again. They head to the cloth merchant and buy a decent outfit. Previously, the poor wore rough, home-woven fabrics. Now, with money to spend, they want something better. They don't seek luxurious velvets or silk meant for the wealthy, but they do look for durable quality cloth. This shift allows textile production centers like Florence, which focus on luxury goods, to survive. But it also sparks the rise of new centers dedicated to producing affordable, low quality cloth. Cities in the Po Valley and Piemonte start to thrive. Wool producers form guilds with regulations stating their cloth must be priced affordably, targeting this emerging market. It's important to note that these changes come only after a significant population decline. While there are reasons to be optimistic, we must also consider the serious implication of such loss, death, and devastation. When the population was halved due to the plague, the remaining people found themselves with more resources per capita, which allowed them to thrive in that context. The economy and social structure adapted to the new reality, creating opportunities for those who survived. Well, you might ask, wow, depopulation is a good thing after all. Well, not so fast, different times. All these theories we hear today about the positive aspects or the benefits of depopulation come from this philosopher, Thomas Robert Malthus, an English cleric and scholar known for his influential ideas on population growth. Malthus is best known for his work in 1798, an essay on the principle of population, where he argued that population tends to grow exponentially while food production grows at an arithmetic rate. This imbalance, he suggested, would lead to resource scarcity, famine, and societal struggle unless checked by factors like disease, war, or moral restraint, which he classifies as positive checks on population growth. While the halving of the population in the Middle Ages led to a resurgence of abundance for those who remained, it's clearly important to state that today's world presents a different scenario. In contrast, today's world, with its advanced technology and larger population, operates under different dynamics where abundance can be maintained even with population growth. With our advanced agricultural technologies and food production methods, we have the capacity to support larger population than ever before. Furthermore, a larger population can bring forward more brilliant minds capable of solving humanity's pressing issues. This growth, coupled with innovation, can lead to solutions that address the challenges we face today and in the future. A Malthusian perspective, which suggests that population growth inevitably leads to resource depletion and catastrophe, would not be beneficial for the world. The Malthusian philosophy is problematic because it underestimates humanity's capacity for innovation, particularly in agriculture and resource management, by presenting a deterministic view that suggests that famine and scarcity are inevitable things, and it can stifle creativity and discourage proactive problem solving. This perspective can also lead to harmful policies that prioritize population control over sustainable development. History shows that society can adapt and thrive despite challenges, making a Malthusian outlook overly pessimistic and counterproductive to progress. Well, if there's one story that you can take out of this lesson here, would be that the human spirit thrives and it becomes stronger, it becomes more innovative. Despite the challenges of the various pandemics of the past, what we have learned is that we're better equipped to face adversities in the future and also to become resourceful people that try to gain advantage, creating and shaping a new world after the disaster, after the death. So we come out of it stronger, that we've learned something from it. And as much as I would like to say the same thing as our recent past 4 years with COVID-19, while health agencies and governments have, pharmaceutical companies have put unduly stress on the population to be subject to an experimental forms of vaccination. Vaccines are positive. I'm not abdicating for the responsibilities for one side or the other, but for sure we've come out of it stronger, even with some slight condemnation that we have against some forms of authoritarian parties and politicians that have caused more harm than good with different methodologies imposed on the populace. But despite that, we have come out, I suppose, I would say, stronger, however, more skeptical toward some authorities, and that makes many people the distinction between free thinkers and those who are apt to follow. But this is really not. I'm not here to make a political statement pro or against any particular side. I'm just stating the obvious and saying that what the human spirit is thriving and is always looking forward and finding different ways to prosper and be successful in the future. And how can we do this? We can do this together. We as humans, not as one side or the other or one nationality or the other. We're all in this together. If there is a disease that can wipe out humanity, it really doesn't matter if you are Chinese, if you're American, if you're South American, if you're Italian, if you're Spanish or whatever. It's going to obliterate humanity as a whole. Therefore, it's important to work together and face the challenges of the future together in a better, productive way. Well, this is all for me today. And if you liked what the lesson, what you hear, what you see, or if you have any ideas or comments or questions, fill out the comments below and drop a like and consider subscribing if you like. And I really do enjoy doing this work, and I will see you next time. Thank you. Bye.